As we've discussed in previous lessons, the APIs in Salesforce Commerce Cloud, both OCAPI and SCAPI, have several levels of security. The first level of security is based on the client ID and the settings we configure in Account Manager. This is where we specify from which instances we allow access by assigning the necessary permissions based on the needs of our project. In Account Manager, we set these permissions and restrictions to control who can interact with the APIs. This is the first security filter, and it's an essential step to protect access to your Commerce Cloud resources. The next level of security is managed at the endpoints level, and this is configured directly in Business Manager. Within the Site Development section, you'll find a key area called Open Commerce API Settings. This is where we define how OCAPI will behave in our project. Here, we decide which resources each client ID can access and what HTTP methods like GET, POST, or PATCH they will be allowed to use. For example, imagine you have several client IDs in your project, each with specific permissions. You could define that a client ID can only make requests from a particular URL and that it only has access to certain methods or resources within the API. This flexibility is crucial for customizing security and permissions based on the different roles or use cases you might have in your environment. When it comes to configuring OCAPI, these settings are managed through something called scopes, which let you define the scope of the configurations. You can set up specific configurations for each site within your instance or apply a global configuration. Let's say you have several sites in production, perhaps in a multi-brand project where each brand has its own site. In this scenario, you could give each client ID unique access settings depending on the site. But if you want to apply the same settings across all sites, that's also possible. And even if you set a global configuration, you still have the option to override it for a specific site. For example, you could allow global access to the product API, but for one specific site, you could restrict that access. This ability to fine-tune configurations gives you full control over how different client IDs interact with your resources. Lastly, it's important to remember that to use OCAPI, you must assign the necessary permissions from the start. Without these permissions, no client ID will be able to interact with the API resources. It's crucial to manage these permissions correctly to ensure not only security, but also the proper functioning of the APIs within Salesforce Commerce Cloud. This process ensures that each client ID has the right level of access based on the project's needs, while always keeping security as the top priority. From the OCAPI settings in Business Manager, we also need to provide specific permissions to each of the client IDs for the resources they will access. We'll dive deeper into this when we explore the JSON format, but here's something to keep in mind. Even if you grant access to a resource, like product search, if you don't specify the read or write permissions for that resource, the system won't automatically grant them. By default, no permissions are given, and you'll end up with a 401 unauthorized error. So we have to actively specify whether the client ID has permission to read, write, or use the resource in another way. If we don't set this up, even with the configuration in place, we'll still encounter that 401 error. Now let's get into the core of the configuration. This setup is done through a text area field in Business Manager, where we'll insert a JSON. This JSON contains certain attributes, and what we're seeing here is well documented in Salesforce's official documentation. In this JSON, we define the configuration version we're using, which is independent of the OCAPI version itself. Then we have a client's property, where we define an array of client IDs. Each client ID will have its own specific settings. What can we configure for each client ID? Well, we can specify the allowed origin as, which could be one or more. This defines from which URL or IP the client ID will be able to send requests. As long as the request comes from a permitted origin listed here, we'll receive the requested information. If a request comes from another source and we have a specific origin set, we'll get an error. Of course, we need to provide the client ID, and we can also specify response headers. But the main focus is on the resources, what resources we are allowing that client ID to access. This might sound a bit abstract now, but it will become clearer when we look into the Shop and Data APIs, where we'll explore the specific resources. For now, just know that resources is an array of endpoints, and these are the endpoints that our client ID will be able to access. Along with that, we define the HTTP methods allowed for each endpoint. We could permit access via GET, POST, PATCH, whatever is provided in the documentation can be added there. We can be restrictive, for example, allowing only GET or only POST, depending on what we need. Another thing to set is whether we want to give read or write permissions for the resource. And something that's often used, especially in production environments, is cache settings. We can specify the cache duration for our requests. For instance, Data API requests typically don't use cache, while Shop API requests generally have a default cache time of 1 minute. You could extend that time if needed. Now you're seeing the syntax for read attributes. If you put an asterisk, it means all attributes for that resource can be read. For write attributes, double asterisks mean all attributes can be written. You can also be more restrictive and define exactly which attributes can be read or written. For example, you might allow reading of CNAME and CStreet attributes, but any other attributes would not have permission to be read. As mentioned, further down, we have a well-defined list of each configuration attribute in the JSON, and I encourage you to take a closer look. But to sum it up, that's the core idea behind what I'm explaining here. An interesting note is the customization aspect of this configuration, which not everyone is aware of. Through this configuration, you can tell OCAPI how you want certain endpoints or resources to respond. For instance, the documentation mentions the Shop API and product image handling. When performing a product search, if you have multiple image types defined in your catalog, such as swatch or thumbnail images, you can specify which type OCAP should return with the product information. So if you specify this, OCAP will return exactly the type of image you requested.